Book 1, Tales of the Wizards, Wonder Tales of the Ancient World. Chapter 1, about the people who told these wonder tales. Most people, I suppose, who ever trouble to think about the Egyptians, think of them as a very wonderful people, but at the same time, a very gloomy and terribly serious people. Their great country seems to be mainly interesting for old stones and old bones, while we think their great buildings, such as the pyramids and some of the temples, very extraordinary. We wonder why in all the world people ever were so silly as to build such things. And when we see their mummies and learn what an amount of thought they used to give to death and to the life that was to come after death, most of this strange idea about the ancient Egyptians has arisen from the fact that nearly all we know about them has come from their tombs. What sort of folk would people think us if they had nothing but our graveyards to go by? We should like rather to be judged by our houses and our home life. But you can't do that with the Egyptians for this reason. When an Egyptian made a tomb for himself, he knew that it was to be his resting place for quite a long while. And so he made it very carefully, but when he built the house, he said, "Well, this may please me, but I shan't live in it for more than a few years, and my son, when he comes after me, may like something quite different." And so he built his house very prettily and comfortably, but very lightly, so that it would last his time and not much more. Perhaps he was wiser after all than we who have to go on sometimes living in places we don't like at all, just because our fathers built them. Anyhow, that is why you learn most about the Egyptians from their tombs, because the tombs have lasted far longer than the houses. Another reason for our curious idea about the Egyptians is because some of the old Greek travelers who went through the country when Greece was very young and Egypt was getting very old brought home some wonderful traveler stories about the tremendous wisdom and seriousness of the Egyptians. Some things they told were true, and some were partly true. Only they had taken them up wrong, and some of them. Well, I think the Egyptians had been playing a quiet joke off on the Greek travelers, and were laughing in their sleeves at them all the time. It was one of these Greeks who first told the story which, more than anything else, has made people believe that the Egyptians were a gloomy, sour, long-faced folk. The story, I mean, of how whenever a company was gathered at a feast, the model of a mummy in its coffin was brought in, dragged round, and shown to everybody with the words, "Look on this, and then eat and drink, for as this is, so shalt thou be." It sounds very unpleasant and uncomfortable, certainly. Well, perhaps they did do that now and again, though certainly they did not do it always, or perhaps even often, but I am very sure that they enjoyed their feast nonetheless. For indeed, instead of being the dark, gloomy, mysterious people that we are apt to imagine them, the Egyptians were really one of the joyful, most light-hearted, and most easily amused of peoples. They were very fond of music and singing, and some of the oldest songs in all the world are the simple old verses that the workmen used to sing at their work. The fisherman as he hauled his nets, the farm servant as he drove the oxen round and round to tread out the corn. They were very fond of sports of all kinds, fishing and fowling and hunting, and when their work or their sport was done, there was nothing they liked better than a big feast with plenty to eat and drink, with garlands of roses to fasten on their heads, and sweet scents to fill the rooms with pleasant odor, and musicians, dancers, and acrobats to keep things going cheerily. I said that most of our knowledge of them came from their tombs. Well, it is from the paintings on the walls of the tombs that all these pictures of feasting and merriment come. And surely they cannot have been so gloomy and sour if they adorned their very tombs with pictures of gladness and fun. Most of the other nations of old days had most unpleasant ideas about the other world to which people go after their life here is done. The Greeks thought of it as a dim, shadowy, gloomy abode, where the ghosts of even the greatest heroes wandered miserably and aimlessly about. The Babylonians and Assyrians called it the land of no return, where people live on dust and mud and dwell in darkness, and the Hebrews called it the pit, and dreaded nothing so much as going down into it. But the Egyptians' heaven was one of the cheeriest places you can imagine, where the good folks who had got there plowed and sowed and reaped the most wonderful corn, whose stalks were 3 yards long, with ears a yard more. and sailed fishing and fowling in little papyrus canoes over beautiful lakes and canals, and then played draughts and enjoyed a glass of beer under the shade of the sycamore trees in the evening. Now, if you want to know what people really are like, I fancy as good a way as any of finding out is to learn what they like to read or to be told. There are some nations in whose literature you can scarcely imagine it possible to find a joke or even a story that is not as solemn as a sermon. But the Egyptians were not like that. They liked a story with all their hearts. They liked it with a little taste of the wonderful and mysterious about it. They liked a joke in it, though some of their jokes seem rather clumsy to us, as I dare say ours would to them, and they liked the story, if possible, to end happily. So you will find nothing very solemn and nothing very terrible in these wonder tales. They are the simple, unaffected attempts of a group of humans on this earth who made stories. No doubt the thing can be very much better done now, it ought to, after 5,000 years' practice, but all the same, these stories should be interesting to us, for they are one of the forerunners of all the great race of Once Upon a Time and of all our modern novels. How is it that these quaint old tales have come down to our times? You can scarcely form any idea of how old they are. Some of them tell us of things that happened, if they ever happened at all, about 5,000 years ago. Some of them belong to much about the time when Abraham was journeying about in the world, and some of them Moses may have heard when he was a schoolboy learning. All the wisdom of the Egyptians. Now, I am very sure that no book of our times is likely ever to last so long as any of these old stories have done. And so the question is, how did they come to last like that? You know that a great deal of the information that has come down to us from the days of ancient Egypt has lasted so long because it was carved in stone upon the walls of some great building. The Egyptians had a very beautiful form of writing, which is called hieroglyphic, or sacred writing. It is really made up of hundreds of little pictures, an eagle for an A, a lion for an M, and so on. And when they had anything very important to write, they carved it in this beautiful picture writing, sometimes filling in the picture letters with brightly colored pastes, so that the whole story blazes with all sorts of colors. But that kind of writing was generally kept for very important things. There is one long poem telling of a great battle between the Egyptians and the Hittites, which is carved on the walls of a great temple in Egypt. But it wasn't everybody who could afford to build a temple when he wanted to publish a poem. So most Egyptian books and all Egyptian storybooks were written not in the beautiful and difficult hieroglyphic, but in one or other of two simpler forms, which we call hieratic or demotic, and they were written not on stone, but on papyrus. The papyrus from which our word paper comes was a reed with a long, fleshy, thick stem which grew plentifully in Egypt. They used to split up the inside of the stem into broad, thin layers, which, when pasted crosswise over one another, were strong enough to bear writing upon. Then the scribe or writer took his palette, which had holes for black ink and for colored inks, and his pens, which were really little brushes made of reeds with their ends bruised, and painted in the letters on the papyrus. Then the papyrus, when it was finished, was rolled together. It might sometimes be a very long roll, for sheet was joined to sheet as the story went on. There is one papyrus in the British Museum more than 130 feet long. It was then put into a case, and when the owner of it wanted to read, he took it out of the case and unrolled a little of the beginning. As he went on, he rolled up on the one side and unrolled on the other until he got to the end. Now, these rolls of papyrus were very costly to make, so that only rich people could afford to have them, and they were very easily destroyed, so that great care had to be taken of them. And sometimes they were prized so much that when the owner of the roll died, he left orders for his favorite roll, or rolls to be buried in his coffin with him. And there the papyrus has lain, beside the mummy of its old owner, for hundreds upon hundreds of years, the desert sands drifting over them both, until some European explorer, or perhaps some Arab thief, has found out the old grave, dug up the coffin, and taken the precious papyrus out of its old master's keeping. Some years ago, a lady's grave was discovered, and when her coffin was opened, they found, beneath her long, beautiful hair, a papyrus roll with part of Homer's great poem, the Iliad, written upon it. Nearly all the stories that follow in this beautiful ancient Egyptian saga were written on papyrus. Where some of them were found is not known. They were sold to tourists who sold them or gave them to museums. But one way or another, they all have been dug up from under the sands of Egypt, which have preserved them safe and sound for all these centuries. Of course, they are very brittle and fragile and have to be very carefully handled, but using them with the greatest care, for they are worth infinitely more than their weight in gold. Scholars have been able to read them and to translate what is written on them into English and French and German, so that we all can listen to the tales that people listened to in palaces and cottages when the world was young. One of the finest of these old rolls, with a long story on it, once belonged to a pharaoh of Egypt, Seti II, when he was crowned prince. He lived about 1200 years before Christ, and his is by no means one of the oldest of the rolls, so that you see how old they are. When we come to read the stories, we may look at them in two ways. The first is the way that only cares for the story itself, that is only anxious to find out what happened to the doomed prince, or how the shipwrecked sailor was saved, or how the ghost made the wizard prince give back the magic roll. After all, stories are meant to be read that way too, and nobody can blame those who like to see their hero or heroine safely settled, and don't care much for anything else. And some of the Egyptian stories are worth reading even from that point of view, especially those in which we can see the seeds from which some of our own favorite stories have sprung. We shall hear later on about the old Egyptian general whose adventures gave the first idea of the story of Ali Baba, and the sailor who was the original of Sinbad, and the prince who has figured in the stories of nearly every country under the sun, sometimes as a prince, sometimes as a princess, but always under the shadow of the doom pronounced at birth by the fates or fairy godmothers. But quite apart from the interest of the stories, we may look at them from the point of view of what they tell us about the land of Egypt itself, the people who lived in it, their manners and customs, what they thought and what they believed, and about the other lands and peoples which lay around Egypt. And in this respect, these stories are of extraordinary value and interest. They give you pictures of all kinds of Egyptian life. You see Pharaoh in his palace, wearying of everything, and asking for stories to be told him, just as the Sultan in the Arabian Nights wearied till Scheherazade took him in hand. You see the extraordinary belief that the Egyptians of all periods had in the power of magic. It appears in the very first story, the story of the Waxen Crocodile, where you have the absolute beginning of the strange belief, which lasted in our own country down to comparatively recent times and still lasts in Italy and other European countries, that you can make waxen images which will become alive and do harm to your enemies, or which can represent your enemies themselves, so that by injuring them you can injure the person you hate. Rossetti's sister Helen, who melts her waxen man that she may have vengeance on her false lover, is first cousin to the learned scribe Uba-aner, who lived more than 5,000 years ago, and made his waxen crocodile to avenge himself on the man who had wronged him. The belief in the efficacy of magic colors almost every one of the tales to the very last, in point of date, the stories of Setna, which are the most magical of all, and one remembers that these last stories belong almost to the very time at which we believe that Moses appeared at the Egyptian court to plead for the oppressed Israelites. The scene in which the little boys sing Osiris, the reincarnation of an old Egyptian sage, confounds the Ethiopian wizard before Pharaoh and his court, is strikingly suggestive of the scenes in the succeeding reign, when a greater power than that of the Ethiopian baffled the wisdom of the Egyptians, and the wizards of the Nile were forced to confess, "This is the finger of God." Once again you go forth with the Egyptian explorer, first on the long roll of those who have sought to penetrate the mysterious continent, and you see the strange dangers and marvels that he believed to lie about his path, talking serpents and vanishing islands, and young ladies who are brought to earth on the wings of a thunderbolt. Or you get a glimpse into the sinister realm of court intrigue, with its atmosphere of suspicion, jealousy, and sudden death. Then, as now, the natural medium in which an ancient monarchy moves, and you see how the exiled Egyptian, suppliant for shelter among the tribes of Palestine, nevertheless comes surely to the top wherever his lot is cast, by virtue of his higher civilization. Stories like that of Tahuti and the doomed prince show you Egyptian sentiment in those days, the days when the land was beginning to waken to the idea of world empire, and to reach forth her hands to those Syrian and Mesopotamian lands which were to be the scene of her greatest glories and the greatest overthrows. And least important, perhaps not placid, peaceful, laborious life of the ordinary Egyptian man, who goes his quiet way, knowing little and caring less of the great deeds of the mighty ones of earth, is mirrored for us in the opening scenes of the tale of the two brothers, with its extraordinary resemblance to the story of Joseph and its strange later maze of reincarnations and wizardries. The stories that you are about to hear cover, from first to last, a period of about 2,000 years, and they are a faithful and unstudied reflection of the changing manners, customs, and beliefs of one of the most interesting peoples of the world during 2 millenniums. There is no body of literature extant in any other land on earth which, from this point of view, has a value even remotely approaching that of these wonder tales of the ancient world of ancient Egypt. Chapter 2. Tales of the Old Magicians. The 3 stories which follow in chapters 2 and 3 are written in an old papyrus which was brought back from Egypt 60 years ago by an English lady, Miss Westcar. She gave it to the famous scholar Lepsius, and it is now in the Berlin Museum and is known as the Westcar Papyrus. It is one of the oldest of all the books of stories which have come down to us, even though the legends of the gods in their original form must, of course, have been the oldest of all. Some scholars hold this book to have been written about the time of the 12th dynasty, not less than 2,000 years before Christ, perhaps around about the time when Abraham was living, and though others do not think it quite so old, all agree that it must date from before 1500s BC. But this, of course, only means that our copy of the stories is 4,000 or at least 3,500 years old. The stories themselves are far older, just as a copy of Shakespeare's plays may be published this year, but contains stories which Shakespeare wrote hundreds of years ago, and some of which were many more 100 years old already when he wrote them down in the form in which we now have them. Thus, these 3 stories are supposed to be told to King Khufu by his 3 sons, Khafra, Baufra, and Hordadef. Now, King Khufu reigned not later than 2900s BC, and some think very much earlier. Khafra's story of the Waxen Crocodile mentions a king who reigned more than 100 years before Khufu, so that these tales take us very far back indeed. They possibly take us back 6,000 years, and even if we take the shorter dates, they refer to events and people of about 5,000 years ago. Perhaps 1,000 years more or less scarcely matters much at that distance. At the very beginning of Egyptian storytelling, we notice that extraordinary belief in and love for magic of all kinds which has already been referred to. Zadkiel and the rest of his tribe would have made their fortunes in Egypt, for the Egyptians believed with all their heart in the influence of the stars, in lucky and unlucky days, in omens of all kinds, and in the influence and significance of dreams. On certain days it was unlucky to bathe, a great deprivation, for the Egyptians of those days were a cleanly race. On others it was certain that if you went in a boat, you would be devoured by a crocodile, while the 13th day of the month, Mekir, was especially unlucky, because on that day the goddess Hathor, or Sekhmet, went forth to slay the men who had rebelled against God, a story that you will find later on. Some people still believe that Egyptian magic was something very real and terrible. Here is a famous spell from which anyone may judge its quality. It is a spell for producing dreams which were supposed to convey knowledge and warning from the gods. Take a cat, black all over, and which has been killed, prepare a writing tablet, and write the following with a solution of myrrh, and the dream which thou desirest to be sent, and put it in the mouth of the cat. Then you would say, Kaimi, Kaimi, I am the great one in whose mouth rests Mamen, Thoth, Nanumbre, Karika, Kaniro, Parmiathon, the sacred Izu who is above the heaven, Amekumu, Numana, Sinana, Ablanathanalba, Lamsor, Akram, Kamaria, Brasuya, Yusu, Tiris, O. The fact of the matter is that Egyptian magic is just as sensible as a word salad pie, and just as useless as a turnip lantern or pumpkin lantern. Khafra's story was written by an anti-suffragist. Women always held a very influential position in Egypt, and this story was written to counteract their undue influence. It is the woman who is at the bottom of the mischief all through the story, and she comes to a very bad end, an end so unusual, for burning alive is scarcely ever heard of elsewhere in Egyptian storytelling, that it is evident that her fate was meant as an awful warning to any of her sex who might be tempted to presume on their favored position in the land, by which it appears that the vexed question of women's rights is scarcely a thing of yesterday. The fact that when Uba-aner takes the terrible crocodile into his hand it becomes nothing but wax again reminds one forcibly of the story of how Moses' rod, which had been changed into a serpent, became a rod again when laid hold of by its owner. Exodus 4. The amusement which Zazamankh the wizard devised for King Seneferu in Prince Baufra's story was exactly paralleled by that employed by the great Khedive of Egypt, Mehemet Ali, to divert him in his hours of ennui. It is not on record, however, that any miracle happened during the progress of his voyage. Prince Hordadef's story really contains two tales. The first, which is really only the introduction, is a simple piece of wizardry, but the story of Rud-Dide and her babies is something more. It was no doubt invented for a political and religious purpose. The fifth dynasty, which succeeded that to which King Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, belonged, was a priestly dynasty devoted to the worship of Ra, the sun god. It is from its rise that the kings of Egypt begin to take, as part of their regular style, the title Son of the Sun. The story which tells how the three babies, whose names in the original are those of the first three kings of the fifth dynasty, namely User-Kaf, Sahur, and Neferu-Kare-Kakai, ne'er really the children of the sun god, was no doubt invented to explain and justify the revolution by which the priests of Ra seized the throne, and to glorify their dynasty. The regard which was paid to kings and to the common folks respectively may be seen in the offerings which King Khufu makes to the kings, his ancestors, and to the wizards. Nebka and Seneferu get 1,000 loaves and 100 jugs of beer. Uba-aner and Zazamankh have to content themselves with 1 loaf and 1 jug of beer. Tales of the old magicians. Once upon a time it fell out that the great King Khufu, lord of the two lands, bearer of the white crown and the red, was in his palace, and time hung heavy on his hands. He turned to this and that, and he knew not what to do, for the day seemed long and weary. At last he said to his sons, the royal princes, who were gathered about his throne, "Is there one among you who can tell me a tale of the wizards of the olden times?" Then the royal son Khafra arose to speak, and he said, "I shall tell your majesty the story of a wonder which befell in the times of your ancestor the King Nebka of happy memory, on an occasion when he was going to the temple of Ptah, lord of Ankhtaui. The story of the Waxen Crocodile. Now it fell out on a day when his majesty went to the temple of Ptah, lord of Ankhtaui, that he paid a visit to the house of the learned scribe, the first reciter, Uba-aner. Now, in the train of his majesty there was a young page, of comely face and form, and when the wife of Uba-aner saw him, her heart was turned away from her husband, and she loved the young man. Without regard for her husband's welfare, she wasted his substance in gifts to the page, and she invited him to spend the day with her in a pavilion by the side of the lake in the garden of Uba-aner. There they passed the day in eating and drinking, and when the evening came, the page bathed in the lake. Now when the steward of the house of Uba-aner saw the falseness of his master's wife, he said to himself, "It is not good that such things should be done, and my master know nothing about them." Therefore when the dawn appeared and the second day came, the steward went to Uba-aner and told him what had happened. When the first reciter, Uba-aner, knew all, he said to his steward, "Bring me the casket of ebony, inlaid with vermilion, which contains my book of spells." When the steward had brought it, Uba-aner fashioned a waxen crocodile, 7 inches long. He recited a spell over it, and he said to it, "When this page comes to bathe in my lake, then drag him to the bottom of the water." He gave the crocodile to the steward and said to him, "Whenever the page goes down to bathe in the lake, throw the waxen crocodile in after him." Then the steward went away and took the crocodile with him. Now it fell out that the wife of Uba-aner sent once more to the page and said to him, "Come and let us make a good day in the pavilion by the lakeside." And to the steward, who had charge of the lake, she said, "Prepare the pavilion by the lakeside, for I am going to spend the day there." The pavilion was prepared and furnished with all kinds of dainties, and the lady and the page came and passed the day in amusements. When the evening came, the page went into the lake to bathe, according to his custom, and the steward cast the waxen crocodile into the water after him. The crocodile changed into a crocodile of 7 cubits long. He seized the page and dragged him under water. Meanwhile, the first reciter, Uba-aner, remained at court 7 days with His Majesty King Nebka, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, while the page lay under the water without breathing. But when the 7 days were past, and when the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebka of happy memory, was going to the temple, the first reciter, Uba-aner, came before him and said, "May it please your majesty to come and see a wonder which has happened in these days of your majesty's reign to a page of your royal retinue?" Then his majesty went with the first reciter, Uba-aner. Uba-aner said to the crocodile, "Bring up the page out of the water," and the crocodile came forth and brought up the page out of the water. "Stop," the first reciter, Uba-aner, said. He cast a spell upon the crocodile and made him stand still before the king. Then his majesty, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nebka of happy memory, cried, "Mercy upon us, this crocodile is dreadful!" Uba-aner stooped down, he seized the crocodile, and it became in his hands nothing but a crocodile of wax once more. Then the first reciter, Uba-aner, told his majesty King Nebka, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, the whole story, and how the page and his wife had deceived him. His majesty said to the crocodile, "Take what is thine." Then the crocodile plunged to the bottom of the lake, and what became of him and the page no one has ever known. Then his majesty of happy memory, King Nebka, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, caused the wife of Uba-aner to be led to the north side of the palace. There they burned her alive and threw her ashes into the river. "Behold, this is the wonder which happened in the days of thine ancestor of happy memory, King Nebka, Lord of Upper and Lower Egypt, one of the wonders wrought by the first reciter, Uba-aner." Then his majesty King Khufu said, "Let there be offered to the majesty of the king Nebka an offering of 1,000 loaves, 100 jugs of beer, a bullock, and 2 measures of incense. And let there be offered also to the chief reciter, Uba-aner, of whose skill I have had proof, a loaf, a jug of beer, and a measure of incense." It was done as his majesty commanded. Then the royal prince Balfour rose to speak, and he said, "I am going to tell your majesty of a wonder which happened in the time of your father, King Seneferu, of happy memory, and which was wrought, among other wonders, by the chief reciter, Zazamankh." The story of Zazamankh and the lost coronet. One day when King Seneferu was in his palace, he was terribly bored with everything. Nothing seemed to please him, and he was dreadfully depressed. He called his household together and asked the courtiers if they could not devise something that would amuse him and help to pass the time. They all suggested different things, but each bored his majesty worse than the other. At last the king said, "Hasten someone and bring to me the chief reciter Zazamankh." They brought him immediately. His majesty said to him, "Zazamankh, my brother, I have called together the whole royal household to see if any of them could invent something to relieve me of my weariness, for my heart is very heavy." But not one of them could imagine anything. Then said Zazamankh, "Let his majesty condescend to go down to the lake of the royal pleasance, and let him man one of the royal barges with all the prettiest girls of the royal harem. Your majesty's heart will grow light as you see them bending to their oars, and when you admire the beauty of the lake and its banks and the fine lawns around it. For my share in this business, behold, This is how I shall arrange the voyage. Let them bring me 20 oars of ebony, inlaid with gold, with blades of tough wood, inlaid with vermilion. And let these 20 girls be chosen from among the very loveliest in the harem, young and fresh, and let them be clothed in fishing nets. All was done according to His Majesty's command. The girls swung to their oars, back and forward, and His Majesty's heart grew light as he watched their rowing, when suddenly the loom of the steering oar of one of the steerswomen struck her hair, and her coronet of new malachite fell into the water. Then she stopped her rowing song and ceased to steer, and her companions on that side of the boat were silent also and ceased rowing. And His Majesty said, "Why have you stopped rowing?" They said, "Our companion has stopped her rowing song and her steering." His Majesty turned to her and said, "Why are you not steering?" She answered, "My coronet of new malachite has fallen into the water." "Never mind," said His Majesty, "go on, and I shall give you another one just as good." But she said, "I want my own coronet, and not another one just as good." "If that is so," said His Majesty, "bring me the chief reciter, Zazamankh." They brought him at once, and His Majesty said, "Zazamankh, my brother, I have taken your advice, and my Majesty's heart has rejoiced to see the rowing of the girls. But behold, the coronet of one of these little ones has fallen into the water. She has stopped singing, she has stopped steering, and checked all her companions on this side of the boat. I said to her, 'Why don't you steer?' And she said, 'My coronet of new malachite has fallen into the water.' I said to her, 'Never mind, go on steering, and I shall give you another one just as good.' But she said, 'I want my own jewel, and not another one just as good.' Then the chief reciter, Zazamankh, arose and spoke wonderful words out of his magic book. Half of the water of the lake rose up and stood upon the other half. The bottom of the lake was bare, for it was 12 cubits deep in the middle before, and now, where it was piled up, it was 24 cubits deep. Then Zazamankh leaped down upon the dry bed of the lake. He found the coronet of malachite lying upon the sand. He took it and gave it back to the girl. Then he reversed his spell, and the water of the lake sank down and was as before. So His Majesty passed a happy day with the royal household, and he rewarded the chief reciter, Zazamankh, with all sorts of good things. Behold, this is the wonder which happened in the days of your father, of happy memory, the King Seneferu, and which was wrought among others by the chief reciter, Zazamankh, the wizard. Then said His Majesty King Khufu, "Let there be presented to His Majesty the King Seneferu, of happy memory, an offering of 1,000 loaves of bread, 100 jugs of beer, a bullock, and 2 measures of incense. And let there be given also a loaf, a pint of beer, and a measure of incense, to the chief reciter Zazamankh, the wizard, of whose skill I have had proof." It was done as His Majesty commanded. Chapter 3. Tales of the Old Magicians. Continued. Dedi the wizard and the sun, God's babies. Then Hordadef, the king's son, rose and said, "May it please your Majesty, so far your Majesty has heard stories of wonders which only the men of bygone days have known, and whose truth no man can swear to, but I am able to bring before your Majesty's eyes a sorcerer of your own day, whom your Majesty does not know." His Majesty said, "Who is he, Hordadef?" Prince Hordadef answered, "He is a man named Dedi, who lives at Dedsneferu, and he is 110 years old, but he still eats every day his 100 loaves of bread and a whole side of beef, and he drinks 100 jugs of beer. He knows how to join on again a head which has been cut off. He knows how to make a lion follow him without a halter, and he knows the plans of the house of Thoth." Now behold, His Majesty King Khufu had long sought those plans of the house of Thoth in order to make a copy of them for his pyramid. Therefore His Majesty said, "Hordadef, my son, bring the man to me yourself." Barges were prepared for the Prince Hordadef, and he set sail for Dedsneferu. When the boats came to the landing place, he sat upon a litter made of ebony, whose poles were of cedar wood inlaid with gold. Then, when he came to Dedsneferu, the litter was set down, and he rose up to salute the wizard. He found him sitting upon a low couch at the door of his house, one slave at his head, scratching it for him, and another, rubbing his feet. Prince Hordadef said to him, "Thy state is that of one who lives in the restful shade of old age. Commonly old age is a coming into harbor, a wrapping of the mummy, a return to the earth, but thus to rest at ease all day long, without bodily infirmities, without decay of one's mental powers, this is indeed a happy lot. I have come in haste to give you a special invitation from my father, His Majesty King Khufu. You shall eat of the best that the king can give and the court provide, and thanks to His Majesty, you shall come at last with honor to your fathers who rest in their tombs." Dedi replied, peace be to thee, Hordadef, royal son, beloved of his father. May thy honorable father praise thee, may he place thee amongst the elders. May thy guardian angel triumph over his enemies, and may thy soul find out the steep paths which lead to the gate of mercy, for verily thou art wise." Prince Hordadef stretched out both hands to him. He helped him to rise, and he walked with him to the landing place, holding his arm. Dedi said to him, "I would need to have a boat for my household and my books." 2 boats with their crews were granted him, and Dedi himself sailed in the barge along with the Prince Hordadef. Now when he had arrived at the court, the prince entered to make his report to the majesty of the king of the 2 Egypts, Khufu, and he said, "Sire, life, health, strength, my master, I have brought Dedi." His Majesty answered, "Bring him quickly to my presence." And when His Majesty had seated himself in the audience hall of Pharaoh, Dedi was presented to him. His Majesty said, "How is it, Dedi, that I have never before seen you?" Dedi answered, "A man can only come when he is called. My king, life, health, strength calls me, and behold, I have come." His Majesty said, "Is it true, as they say of you, that you can join on again a head which has been cut off?" Dedi answered, "Surely it is true, sire, my master." Then said His Majesty, "Bring hither a prisoner of those who are lying in prison under sentence of death." But Dedi cried, "No, no, your Majesty, not a man. Do not let us venture such a thing upon a human being." So a goose was brought to him, and its head was cut off, and the goose was placed at the right side of the hall, and its head at the left side. Then Dedi spoke words of power out of his book of spells. The goose rose up and hopped forward, the head did the same, and when the one had joined the other, the goose stood up and cackled. Then a pelican was brought, and the same thing happened. His Majesty ordered a bull to be brought, and its head was struck off and fell to the ground with its halter. Dedi recited his spells, and the bull stood upright behind him, but its halter still lay upon the ground. Then said King Khufu, "Do you know that people say of you that you know the plans of the house of Thoth?" Dedi answered, "Pardon me, your Majesty, I do not know the plans themselves, but I know where they are." "And where is that?" said His Majesty. Dedi said to him, "There is a block of gritstone in one of the chambers of the library at Heliopolis, and the plans of the house of Thoth are in the block." Then said the king, "Bring me the plans which are in this block." But Dedi said to him, "May it please your Majesty, it is not I who shall bring them. Who then shall bring them to me? Aid the king." And Dedi answered, "They shall be brought to you by the eldest of the 3 children, who shall be born of Rud-Dide." "By my faith," said His Majesty, "and who is she, this Rud-Dide of whom you speak?" Dedi answered him, "She is the wife of a priest of the god Ra, lord of Sakabu. She shall bear 3 children, who shall be the sons of Ra, lord of Sakabu. And the great God has said that they shall exercise this excellent dignity over this whole land. They shall be kings, and the eldest of them shall be also high priest at Heliopolis." Then His Majesty's heart was troubled, but Dedi said to him, "Why are your thoughts so sad, sire, my master? Is it because of these 3 children? Verily, I tell thee, it shall not happen in thy day. Thy son shall reign, then his son, and then one of these." Then said His Majesty, "When shall the children be born?" The wizard replied, "They shall be born on the 15th of the month Tybi." The king said, "If the banks of the canal of Letopolis were cut, I would go there myself to see the temple of Ra, lord of Sakabu." And Dedi answered, "Then I will cause that there shall be 4 cubits of water between the banks of the canal of Letopolis." When His Majesty had returned into his chamber, he said, Let Dedi be lodged in the house of Prince Hordadef, and let him dwell with him, and let there be given to him a daily ration of 1,000 loaves, 100 jugs of beer, an ox, and 100 bunches of onions. It was done as his majesty had commanded. Now it came to pass that the time for the birth of the children drew nigh. The majesty of Ra, lord of Sakabu, said to Isis, to Nephthys, to Meskhent, to Hecht, and to Khnummu, "Go and watch over the birth of these 3 children of Rud-didet, who shall reign over this whole land, building your temples, furnishing your altars of offerings, supplying your libation tables, and adding to your endowments." Then these divinities set forth. The goddesses changed themselves into singing girls, and Khnummu went with them in the guise of a porter. They arrived at the house of Ra-user, and they found him spreading out linen. They passed before him with their musical instruments, and told him that they had come to be present at the birth of the children. When the children were born, beautiful in all their members, they said, "These are kings who shall reign over this whole land of Egypt." Then the goddesses went forth and said to Ra-user, "Rejoice, Ra-user, for, behold, 3 children are born to thee." He said to them, "My ladies, and what can I do for you? Behold, let me give this bushel of barley to your porter, that you may carry it away as your wages to the brew house." So Khnummu loaded himself with the barley, and they set out for the place whence they had come. But Isis said to the others, "What are we thinking about, that we have come to the house of Ra-user without doing a wonder for these children, that we may tell it to their father who has sent us, that is, to the god Ra?" Then they made 3 royal diadems and hid them in the barley. They brought down a storm of rain from heaven. They returned to the house of Ra-user, and they said, "Store for us this barley in a sealed chamber until we come north again." So the grain was stored in a sealed chamber. Now it fell out that one day, a fortnight after the children were born, Rud-didet said to her servant, "Is everything in good order in the house?" The servant answered, "All things are in order. Only the barley for brewing has not been brought." Then said Rud-didet, "Why is the brewing barley not brought?" The servant said, "It might have been ready long ago, only it was given to these singing girls and lies in the chamber sealed with their seal." So Rud-didet said, "Go down and fetch it. Ra-user will give them more in place of it when they come back again." The servant went and opened the room. Behold, she heard voices, singing, music, and dancing, all that one would do to welcome a king in the room. She came back and told Rud-didet what she had heard. Then Rud-didet came down to the room and could not find the place whence the sound came. She placed her head against the sack of barley, and found that the noise was inside it. Therefore she placed the sack in a wooden coffer. She sealed it with another seal, she tied it round with leather, and she placed the whole in the storeroom, and sealed the door with her own seal. When Ra-user returned from working in his garden, Rud-didet told him the whole affair, and he was highly delighted, and they sat down and made a holiday of it. Now, some time after all this, it befell that Rud-didet quarreled with her servant, and caused her to be beaten. The servant said to the others who were in the house, "Does she think that she can treat me thus, she who has borne 3 kings? I will go and tell the whole affair to his gracious majesty King Khufu." So she went away, and she found her uncle, her mother's brother, who was busy bundling up flax. He said to her, "Whither goest thou, my little maid?" And she told him the whole story. Then said her uncle, "And you have the impudence to come to me. I will teach you to rebel and play the traitress." So he took a bunch of the flax and gave her a sound thrashing. The servant ran down to the river to bathe her bruises, and behold, a crocodile carried her away. When her uncle ran to Rud-didet to tell her what had happened, he found the lady seated, her head bowed upon her knees, and her heart sadder than tongue can tell. He said to her, "Madame, why so sad?" She answered, "Because of that little slut who was in the house. Behold, she has gone away, saying, 'I will go, and I will denounce them to the king.'" Then the uncle made salam, and said to her, "My lady, when she came to tell me what had happened and made complaint to me, I gave her a sound beating. Then she went to bathe her bruises, and lo, a crocodile carried her away." The rest of the story is lost, but probably it may have contained the account of how King Khufu endeavored to obtain possession of the children who were to dethrone his descendants. and how the sun god's children escaped his efforts and came at last to the throne.